I woke up at 7 a.m., took a shower, and got the kids out of bed. After preparing their breakfast and school lunches, I woke Tracy in time for her to get 11-year-old James and 8-year-old Maddie onto the school bus. She was tired from a late tennis tournament the night before. After kissing the kids goodbye, I left for work at 8 a.m. as the foreman for the local authority's construction crew. It was a typical day, and I got home shortly after 5 p.m. Since it was payday, I stopped by an ATM to withdraw some cash for the weekend. Unfortunately, the machine ate my card without giving any warning or returning it. It was foolish of me to try using my credit card to get cash. The machine swallowed that too, and the bank was closed. Maddie's birthday was on Sunday, and I had planned to spend Saturday finding her a special gift. Frustrated, I headed home, only to notice Tracy's car wasn't in the driveway. Concerned, I rushed to the front door, hoping she hadn't taken the kids back to an empty house. I had asked her to call me if she needed to do anything important after school, so I could come home early. As I inserted the key into the lock, a voice behind me called, "Mr. David Brown." I turned to see a middle-aged man handing me a yellow A4 envelope with "Slug and Pike" printed in one corner. He simply said, "You've been served," and walked away. Confused, I entered the house, which felt unusually empty. 2 minutes later it hit me. Not only were my family members gone, but so were their clothes and belongings. There was no note or message on the phone, nothing at all. The only clue amidst the confusion surrounding me was a yellow envelope resting on the kitchen table. I opened it and quickly realized the first document was a divorce petition. I had never seen one before, but the title left no doubt. There were sticky notes sticking out the side, marked "Sign Here." I didn't bother reading it in detail, and moved on to the next document, which was more difficult to understand. It soon became clear that this second document stated I had 2 months to vacate my home so it could be sold. What the hell? The third document was even more bewildering. It revealed that someone named Michael Smith wanted to adopt my children. Again, what the hell? The final document left no ambiguity. It was a restraining order, banning me from coming within 200 yards of my wife, children, or Mr. Michael Smith's residence at 12 Riverview Drive. Blah, blah, blah. I felt completely lost, the magnitude of the changes in my life threatening to crush my soul. Perhaps it would have happened eventually, but I had no idea things had gotten so bad. My innate emotional defenses kicked in, keeping me from losing my sanity. At first, my mind was blank, but gradually, bits of certainty began to emerge. My wife had left me, seemingly to pursue a relationship with someone I'd never even heard of. She'd taken the children, leaving me alone to face this new reality. Tracy asked me to let the children go so Michael Smith could adopt them. She froze all our joint bank accounts and planned to sell the house to raise funds. Michael Smith, her accomplice in this betrayal, lived at 12 Riverview Drive. To make matters worse, I felt ashamed of my ignorance. If Tracy had reached this decision, it must have been building up for a long time, and I hadn't noticed a single clue. I knew Tracy wasn't particularly bright, so the only conclusion I could draw was that I had been extremely oblivious. I searched my memory for any signs from the past. Sure, Tracy had been somewhat distant around 6 months ago, but when I mentioned it, she snapped out of it, and our life, which had become a shadow of its former self, returned with renewed energy. In fact, it seemed stronger and more vibrant than ever before. I no longer recognized the sexually reserved wife I once knew. She had transformed into someone more daring and passionate. Reflecting on some of our recent bedroom activities, I laughed bitterly, wondering if she had already explored these experiences with Mr. Smith. It wasn't the Tracy I thought I knew. The realization sent a chill through me. I now believed she had always wanted to explore these things, but her strict upbringing had held her back, at least with someone she respected. The inevitable conclusion was both sad and ironic. Tracy had lost respect for me 6 months ago. 6 months ago, Tracy lost respect for me, which was heartbreaking. Hold that thought, Dave, I told myself. You'll need every bit of humor to get through what's coming. Still in disbelief, I decided to take my first action, which might surprise those who hadn't read my latest psychological evaluation. My employer had recently polled all senior staff members, and I was proud of one line in the report. Mr. Brown doesn't exactly follow the rules. It was a subtle way of saying I was a results-oriented cowboy who got things done using only the broadest guidelines. This was followed by the highest professional compliment I'd ever received. During a performance review that year, my straightforward supervisor sat me down and said, "Dave, whenever there's a tough job to do, I assign it to you. On that day, I record in my journal how I think you'll handle it and how long it will take. I'm pleased to say I've never been wrong." He gave me top marks, and we shared a hearty laugh. Unfortunately, it didn't mean much because I was already at the peak of my career with my current qualifications, and the pressure of supporting a family had kept me from completing my engineering degree and advancing further. Half an hour later, I found myself parked near 12 Riverview Drive, definitely not 200 meters away. Tracy's car was there, but there was no sign of life. This was the most upscale area in our city, with mansions lining the street. I imagined Smith's house was just as grand as the others. Suddenly, the name Smith sounded strangely familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. Could Michael Smith be the obnoxious guy from those TV commercials? The one who insisted on appearing in his own ads that rotated with tedious regularity every week? If I recall correctly, he owns one of the city's few supermarkets, acquired in a hostile takeover about 2 years ago. If I'm right, I'm in deep trouble. This guy is a big deal. My thoughts were interrupted when the front door opened, and he got into his car and drove away. I recognized him as the same middle-aged man who had served me the papers a little over an hour earlier. This prompted me to open the yellow packet I had brought along and read the divorce petition. It felt like a declaration of war. Tracy was demanding everything: the house, the car, cash, alimony, and child support. Furthermore, I would have no access to the children. I knew Tracy was competitive. She always had to win everything and insisted on crushing her opponents in the process. This petition was so typical of her. As I was processing this, the door reopened about 30 minutes later. A well-dressed woman, approximately 40 years old, appeared on the front step. A 50-year-old man came out, set a large bag near her, and then went back inside, closing the door. The woman stood there for several minutes, clutching a familiar yellow packet in her hands. Finally, she rolled her bag to the gate and began walking down the street towards me. Her expression mirrored the confusion I felt. As she approached my car, I stepped out to meet her. She stopped 2 steps away, her eyes red and glassy from crying, and held an envelope. Holding an envelope in one hand and her suitcase handle in the other, she looked at me, her face a mirror of my own shock and confusion. I simply extended my envelope to her and said, "Snap." She burst into tears, recognizing the situation we both found ourselves in. She stood motionless as I loaded her bag into my trunk and opened the car door for her, aware that we were being watched and that the police could be called at any moment. I drove a short distance, took a few turns, and parked. The realization that she was in the same situation triggered a protective instinct in me, clearing my mind a bit. Even with tear-filled eyes, she was a stunning woman who showed no signs of taking the initiative. I introduced myself. "My name is Dave, and I think my wife knows your spouse." She turned her grief-stricken gaze to me and smiled softly. As I watched her, I noticed her grief seemed to ease slightly. "I'm Wendy. Is your wife's name Tracy?" she asked. I nodded. Wendy continued. "I discovered them in bed together last month. I thought things were improving between us, but tonight—" She broke into tears again, and I gave her time to settle down. Tracy's complete betrayal didn't surprise me as much as I had expected. "Is there anywhere I can drop you off? Maybe with relatives or friends?" I asked. Wendy shook her head. "I have no relatives here, and Michael has alienated me from all of my friends." I asked if she had eaten, and she shook her head again. Checking my wallet, I found less than $150, so I drove to a known low-cost eatery to get us some food. I led Wendy inside the restaurant, and to make a long story short, we shared our life stories. I was 32 years old, married in my second year of university, and dropped out the following year after an unplanned pregnancy due to a contraceptive failure. Tracy was against abortion, so I left school to support our family. Tracy didn't work, and I believed we had a good marriage. I resented her laziness a bit, but I accepted it. In our increasingly selfish world, Tracy seemed like a dedicated mother to others, which irritated me because, in private, she was carefree and self-centered. I stopped bringing up this sensitive topic long ago. Since my parents' deaths, I had cared deeply for our children, being an only child myself. My family was all I had. Wendy, on the other hand, was 41 years old. She had been abandoned by her mother, and her father, despite doing his best, succumbed to stress and passed away early. Her marriage to the considerably older Michael Smith had seemed to go well, but they had no children. Michael blamed her for this, refusing to undergo any infertility tests, and pointing to his numerous siblings as evidence of his fertility. Her inheritance was spent on building Michael's business. Wendy went to the ATM across the street from the restaurant, as I suggested, to check if any of her cards were still working. It seemed our spouse's conspiracy was meticulous and well-planned. Given enough time, we might have been able to mount a successful counterattack, but at that moment, we were dejected, bewildered, and lost. In retrospect, sharing our troubles with each other provided some comfort and perspective amidst the chaos. At the time, talking with Wendy felt like therapy for me. Wendy was still unsure about her future, so I encouraged her to stay in my large but now empty house until she had a plan. I assured her that my offer was purely out of respect and that I had no ulterior motives. We drove back to my place, and I helped her settle into the guest room. Later, we shared a bottle of wine, and she reached out to place her hand over mine as I confided in her about my fears of not being able to see my children as often as I wanted, or possibly at all. Her empathy brought tears to her eyes, a gesture of compassion that I found difficult to express myself due to my upbringing. Our conversation felt like a traditional counseling session, and by the end of the first bottle, we had come to some important realizations. It was clear that Tracy and Michael's actions were meant to keep us off balance and discourage us from hiring our own attorneys. Tracy's motivations were unclear, but it was evident she was determined to win, as usual. The idea of an equitable division of children and property upon the dissolution of our marriage was not in her character, so an amicable divorce was out of the question. Wendy seemed to be a genuinely good person, and through our conversation it became clear she could be a valuable ally during this challenging time. As emotional allies, we retired to our separate bedrooms, comforted by the fact that we were not entirely alone in the world. The following day, we kept each other distracted to prevent the new circumstances from overwhelming us. When Wendy became frustrated, I encouraged her with stories and jokes. When I felt the darkness closing in, she made me laugh. It was an unusual day, but we managed to get through it together. Despite her beauty, Wendy was somewhat mysterious and shy. With no other source of income, we pooled our money and shopped on a budget. We didn't go hungry, and for a few weeks we actually enjoyed the experience of shopping frugally. For Wendy, who had lived comfortably since her marriage to Mr. Smith, this was a clear cultural shock. We started talking about our future goals, but the conversation became too painful. On Saturday night, we watched a lovely movie together. Wendy was still in bed on Sunday morning when Tracy's father, John, and younger sister, Beth, arrived unexpectedly. I invited them in for coffee. We had always gotten along well, and I suspected Beth had harbored feelings for me, especially since her ex-husband had run off with his secretary. Wendy emerged at the kitchen doorway wearing her bathrobe just as the coffee was brewing. She apologized, clearly embarrassed to be seen this way. John raised an eyebrow and looked at me angrily. Before he could say anything, I quickly clarified. "Before you disgrace yourself, Dad, this is the wife of the man your daughter is involved with." Living with. He threw her out of the house on Friday, the day I met her. She had nowhere else to go, so I offered her a place to stay. You see, I'm not the only one your offspring is trying to crush. John looked taken aback and then said, "I apologize, Dave. Tracy's mother was supposed to come, but she's too embarrassed. We know what Tracy did to you, and I just wanted you to know how angry I am with her. I didn't bother telling her to leave our life. But you know how it is with grandchildren and all that." "I understand, Dad. Thank you for your views," I responded. "What baffles me the most is why she's doing this. I understand her strategies, taking all the money, leaving me with nothing, and taking the house. It's all part of her winning strategy, but why?" The look on John's face indicated he was previously unaware of the financial situation. His eyes widened in shock. "Do you mean she took everything?" "Yes, Dad. All our accounts appear to be closed. I don't have a single bean left. She's given me a notice to leave the house and barred me from seeing the children." John's eyes widened further, horrified at what his daughter was capable of. He couldn't look me in the eyes. I'm sorry, Dave. What a scumbag. But I can answer your question. She told my mother and me yesterday why. In a nutshell, it's about money. She said you've already maxed out, and she wants more. She believes that being with a wealthy man will provide her with the lifestyle she desires. He's in his 50s, and from the way she talks about him, I can... John continued, she doesn't really like him. I'd be cautious if I were him. I believe once she marries him, she'll leave him and take whatever she can get. I'm not sure how I raised such a mercenary. That's a lot of money, Dad. Her decision not to terminate my first pregnancy led me to drop out of university. If I had continued, I'd be at the top of a tall tree right now, not stuck at the bottom of a small one. John just shrugged. So, Dad, why take the kids? We both know she isn't a good mother. Why not just take the money and leave me with my children? I don't know, son, John replied, as he noticed Beth staring at him with disbelief but remaining silent, clearly humiliated. John made his final apologies, shook my hand, and I made him promise to embrace my child on her birthday. Beth leaned in and whispered, I'll be back in an hour. It was all quite intriguing. Wendy and I were having breakfast when two mutual friends of Tracy and mine arrived. They had seen Tracy with an older man at the restaurant the night before and were curious about what was going on. I explained the situation from my perspective, and Wendy shared her side of the story. Both friends were appalled by Tracy's actions and questioned why she had left with the children. They had apparently witnessed Tracy putting on a nice mommy act in public. Just as we finished sharing the details, one of Tracy's other friends arrived. We all recounted the story to her, and she was as shocked and frightened as everyone else. We were still talking when Beth returned. She pulled me aside and handed me an envelope. Beth handed me an envelope and said, There's $1,000 in there, Dave. Let's call it atonement for my sister. I hesitated, my pride struggling against my desperation, but I took the envelope. Thank you, I said sincerely. Beth continued, I also wanted you to know that Dad hasn't been entirely honest with you. Tracy came over yesterday to pick up the kids and shared almost everything. I got the rest from her later. I have to say, Dave, she's playing a smart game. Asking for money in the house is part of her strategy. They plan to use the money as a bargaining chip, which they'll reluctantly use if you cooperate. Grant the divorce and allow Michael to adopt your children, Beth advised. He's childless and wants to pass on his empire. After your divorce, Tracy will convince him she wants a child with him. Once she secures his fortune, she'll maintain her lifestyle. If you can wait, I'm confident she'll lose interest in Jimmy and Maddie and return them to you. I stared at Beth, incredulous. There was a chilling, almost sociopathic clarity to her words. Michael already had a trophy wife, which explained why he might be drawn to Tracy despite her lack of conventional beauty. The allure of an obviously fertile woman could be compelling. I found Beth's analysis unsettling, but I agreed with her conclusion. Tracy's motivations were calculating and self-serving. Beth explained, Tracy experienced severe preeclampsia during both pregnancies, and her second C-section was due to it. She chose to undergo a hysterectomy at the same time, but she apparently didn't inform her family or her new boyfriend about it. This, along with her other behaviors, reveals just how deceitful she has become. I asked, What did Tracy look like when she spoke with you? Beth replied, If you want to know how she felt about what she did to you, Dave, the answer is guilty. She tried to hide it, but I could tell it was tearing her apart. She knows she's ruined a decent man, but you know her. Guilt won't stop her. I then asked, Why are you supporting me, Beth? She answered, It's simply the right thing to do, Dave. Growing up, my sister always bullied me, and what she's doing to you is just wrong. It offends my sensibilities. I've been where you are now, feeling abandoned. You were there for me when I was struggling with my own issues, but Tracy never showed that kind of support. I'm glad I have a chance to repay the favor. I'm on your side, Dave. I've always felt sympathy for you, and I can't imagine you being treated this way. I responded, Well, Beth, I don't know what to say. I began, but then reconsidered. No, that's not right. I don't want us to sleep together. That would be too strange. Besides, I've been dating someone seriously for almost a month now. I'm glad for you, Beth, I said. You've always been my favorite relative, and I hope this guy is the right one for you. Thank you, Dave. Just trust me to help in any way I can. Consider me your personal spy. We hugged, and she left. I returned to Wendy and our friends. By evening, we had to call 3 more friends to explain what was happening. Their support and sympathy were overwhelming and distressing. After dinner, we cooked together and talked about the future. And I took $200 from the stash Beth had given me and handed one portion to Wendy. I showed her where I had hidden the rest in the cookie jar, alongside Beth's gift. I hoped it would see us through until the next payday. I told Wendy about Beth's involvement today, and she wasn't surprised. Her own infertility issues had been a growing concern in her marriage. Wendy noticed I was particularly agitated at this time of day and asked, "What are we going to do?" I replied, "My first priority is my children's well-being, and that certainly doesn't include leaving them in the hands of these schemers. I must ensure I have the means to care for them, including finding money. I haven't figured out how to exact my revenge yet, but the idea of them going unpunished offends me greatly. How about you, Wendy?" Her exquisite face abruptly hardened. "If you had simply sought a divorce and given me a fair share of our possessions, I would have been satisfied. Now I feel humiliated. Please don't take this the wrong way, Dave, but right now, all I want is to see him burn." Her passionate declaration made me resolve never to lash out at her. I grinned, letting her know I understood. "Okay, now that we know where we stand, let's focus on how to move forward," I suggested. We spent the next 3 hours brainstorming and discussing ideas. We reviewed and rejected various methods to raise funds for hiring lawyers, struggling to find satisfaction in being primarily law-abiding people. Our discussions centered on legal and ethical strategies for winning, but we hit a dead end. Seeing no clear solution, I asked Wendy about the affluence they had moved to when they relocated 2 years ago. She explained that Michael had taken advantage by purchasing a house and a shop, using them as leverage. He had borrowed $2.5 million for expansion, which was his only noticeable weakness. We talked about how to exploit that weakness to our advantage. If we could threaten his business, we might gain enough leverage to improve our position. Appointments with the kids were my main concern. I didn't care about money, but my children meant everything to me. Wendy was eager to take drastic measures like burning down his shop, but I couldn't bring myself to criticize the way he made his living, even if he was a lowlife. We went to bed too late on Sunday. By Monday at work, I informed my supervisor about my situation. He did what he could to help, granting me a short-term vacation and an advance on my annual leave. I tried to keep up with my usual tasks, but it was incredibly difficult. I missed my kids every second of the day. In the afternoons, I gave up and spent time with the comptroller and the administration's legal counsel. Let me pause here to tell you about the people I work with. There's a negative perception of local government workers. While the job is secure, the pay is poor, which makes us social outcasts of sorts. We stick together, looking out for one another. If I was in charge of road work and had some leftover materials, let's just say neither the comptroller nor the lawyer had to worry about gravel driveways by the end of the day. By the end of the day, I had learned a lot more about business finance and legal matters than I had in the morning. Wendy and I continued to discuss the day's events at home. After spending the day job hunting, Wendy prepared dinner. She had worked as an accounting assistant before leaving her job to become a wife. We were winding down after cleaning up when the phone rang, and a call at 7:30 p.m. altered my life. "Daddy, where are you? Daddy!" It was Maddie. A lump rose in my throat. "I'm here, honey, in our house." "I don't like it here, Daddy, please." I could hear Tracy's voice in the background. "Maddie, who are you talking to?" Voice cut in, and then the line went dead. Wendy saw the thunderous look on my face and asked who it was. "Maddie," I replied, heading for the door. Wendy tried to hold me back. "Dave, don't! That's what they want. They want to get you arrested for breaking the restraining order. Don't do it." Her words made me pause. Instead of storming out, I went upstairs to my bedroom to gather my thoughts. I'm not sure how long I lay there, but eventually there was a faint knock on the door. Wendy entered with 3 children's books. "Can you read me a story?" she asked. I stared at her for a moment, then silently motioned for her to lie down beside me. I picked up Maddie's favorite book and began to read. By the end, I felt calm again. I leaned over and kissed Wendy on the forehead, a gesture of affection I had reserved for Maddie for the past 8 years. Wendy smiled. Until then, I had pushed thoughts of my children to the back of my mind. The idea of losing them or raising them alone was too emotionally overwhelming. Just then, the doorbell rang. I was surprised to see Sophia standing there. She was always called Sophie, but now she was Sophia. She was Tracy's best friend, and we had always gotten along well. I invited her in and introduced her to Wendy. Sophia had trouble making eye contact with either of us. After a brief conversation, she finally said, "I came to apologize." "I just wanted to apologize, Dave," Sophia said, her voice full of regret. "Tracy put me in a tough spot. I knew exactly what she was planning, which is why I've barely seen you in the last 5 months. She made me promise not to tell you about her affair. I tried to convince her not to go through with it, but you know how stubborn she can be. I knew she would divorce you and fight over the children, and I stayed silent while she talked about her plans." In front of me stood a woman visibly burdened by guilt. My initial reaction was that of distrust. If she sought sympathy, she would be disappointed. But then I realized that someone with a troubled conscience might be a valuable source of information. Her remorse could work to my advantage. I decided to offer a little reassurance. "It's okay, Sophia. I understand how difficult this situation must be for you," I said. "Thank you for coming forward." "Thank you, Dave. I know she froze our accounts and left me with nothing," Sophia continued. "I saw her tonight, and she was boasting about it. I say boasting, but it felt more like bravado. I think she feels a lot of guilt about what she's done to you." Sophia, who had struggled to make eye contact before, now looked directly into my eyes. "For the record, Dave, I never believed what she said about you hitting the kids. I've seen you interact with James, and it's clear to me that you're a good father." "Maddie and I both know you'd never do that," Sophia said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "But she reported you to child services, accusing you of abuse. Although they couldn't prosecute due to lack of evidence, the mere allegations were enough to get a restraining order." I sank into my chair, stunned by the revelation. Damn, I was 5 times the parent she was. My guests watched as a storm of emotions flickered across my face. I pushed aside everything except the final emotion, pure, unrelenting hatred. When my thoughts finally settled, clarity emerged. I realized I needed to fight as ruthlessly as she did. If one side fights dirty and the other stays clean, the outcome is inevitable. I knew I had to match her level of deceit with a strategy of my own, one that required creativity and cunning. "It's clear now," I said, my voice tight with resolve. "She's not stopping at anything to win. I've never been violent, but if that's what it takes to protect my children, I'll do whatever it takes." Sophia nodded. "I can see the determination in your eyes. Like I said, what she told me about you didn't add up. I know plenty of fathers who spend time with their kids at bars or on fishing trips. I've seen you with yours. You're dedicated and willing to go to any lengths for them. She's a liar and a con artist." I leaned forward. "Sophia, do you know what her full plan is?" She continued. "We've learned from another source that she intends to use our money and the house to gain full custody of the children. Then she'll have Wendy's husband adopt them, promising to have a child with him. He's eager for an heir, and she'll delay having a baby with him until after they're married, saying she doesn't want their child born out of wedlock. But we know she can't have more kids. Mike Smith doesn't know that. By the time he finds out, she'll have swapped half of our modest assets for half of his fortune. The collateral damage to me is enormous." The weight of her words sank in, fueling my resolve. "The concern you show for the kids is real, and you're right. Tracy doesn't deserve any of your assets," Sophia said, her voice full of sincerity. "But what kind of best friend would lie to you about her husband abusing their children?" I paused, letting the truth sink in. Sophia's humiliation was palpable as she excused herself and left. I attempted to retreat upstairs to process my emotions, but Wendy stopped me. Without a word, she held me, offering silent comfort to 2 souls in distress. Eventually, I thanked her, and we settled in for the night. I'm not sure how much rest Wendy got, but I barely slept. My anger over Tracy's deceit clashed with the pain from Maddie's call. I finally gave up trying to sleep around 4 a.m., when the outlines of a plan began to take shape in my mind. Wendy woke me by opening the curtains. "Good morning, sleepyhead. Breakfast is ready," she said cheerfully. After a quick shower, I headed downstairs. Even though it was early, I called my boss and requested some time off. He agreed without hesitation. Wendy watched me across the kitchen table. "Wendy, how far are you willing to go?" I asked. Yes, David, I didn't realize you cared so much, she replied, playfully tousling her hair and smirking. I grinned back, a bit cheeky. I mean, how dirty are you willing to get in this fight? I clarified. Try me, Wendy said with determination. Well, I said, I'm considering destroying your husband's business, dismantling my wife's support network, and completely derailing her plans, leaving them both as wrecks. That sounds like a solid starting point, Wendy agreed. I have some ideas to add. After breakfast, we compared our findings. While Wendy delved into libel and slander laws online, I reached out to Tracy's mother. My hunch was correct. She was completely unaware of Tracy's involvement with child services and was horrified by her daughter's actions. Next, I called Beth, relaying the situation to her. Initially, she was ready to disown her sister, but I persuaded her to keep her feelings in check and act as our insider. By the time I finished my calls, Wendy had completed her research. We spent an hour in the workshop, crafting 2 signs. A short while later, Wendy and I set up in front of Michael Smith's office building, which I knew was on land leased from the local authority, so we were well within our rights. We positioned ourselves prominently but without obstructing the entrance. I held a sign that read, "Talk to me about how the owner of this store stole my wife and children." Wendy's sign read, "Talk to me about my husband's morals." As anticipated, Wendy's sign drew more attention. She was far more visually appealing than I was. It quickly became clear that while people were hesitant to approach me alone, once a few had stopped, others felt emboldened to engage. When they did, I simply shared the facts of the situation. Wendy's research had confirmed that as long as we stuck to the truth, we were protected from libel charges. To our satisfaction, nearly everyone we spoke to chose to take their business elsewhere. People seemed genuinely offended by Tracy's actions, and many were moved by my story. Women in particular expressed outrage over the situation. Although our actions had a minimal impact on business, our plan was progressing. Amidst the general public, we attracted some notable visitors. Just before lunch, the store manager approached us, threatening to call the police. Wendy captured the moment on film, where I offered to give him the emergency phone number for the police. True to his word, the police arrived shortly after lunch. After a brief discussion with the store's management, they asked us to move our chairs slightly to avoid obstructing foot traffic. Our confidence in the plan grew around 4 p.m. when a local radio reporter approached us, requesting an interview. As Wendy and I shared our stories, a crowd began to form, drawn particularly by my allegations of child abuse. The topic of child abuse is so sensitive that the accused rarely confronts it directly, which piqued the crowd's interest. The reporter and crew assured us they would stick to the facts. We spent the evening waiting for the store to close, saying goodnight to the manager as he locked up and promising to return the next day. That night, we were thrilled to see our story covered on the local news. The following morning, we greeted the manager with a cheery, "Good day." Shortly thereafter, 2 uniformed security guards arrived and effectively placed themselves between us and potential interlocutors. I called the police again, who arrived and spoke to the manager about his attempts to stifle our free speech. To keep the crowd entertained and satisfied, I treated the officers to coffee from a vendor set up to cater to the gathering. That day, we were the town's main attraction. Wendy truly outshone with her abandoned wife look. She could easily pass as an actress with her striking appearance. We were so focused on watching the state television news van parked across the street that we didn't notice 2 men in suits approaching us. It wasn't until I was handed a cease and desist order threatening legal action for an estimated $30,000 in daily losses that we realized the gravity of the situation. The entire confrontation had been recorded digitally. The men in suits left in a hurry, leaving us to continue discussing our story with a reporter. We reiterated our commitment to sticking to the facts and requested that no embellishments be made. Clutching a letterhead from Slugged, Ann, and Pike, we wrapped up another productive day and headed home. As we left, a sizable crowd remained outside the store, eagerly waiting for more updates. We hurried back to catch the nightly news, and I half-jokingly suggested that Wendy should consider getting an agent. When the story aired, it was disheartening. The camera crew had set up outside the mansion, and seeing my bewildered children being hurriedly shielded from view was like a knife to the heart. That night, I read another story to Wendy as we dealt with an average of 10 phone calls daily from friends and acquaintances, all expressing their outrage at Tracy's actions. I thanked them, and with a touch of irony, assured them that my vote for Tracy's friendship was firmly cast with my feet. At 9:30 p.m., Sophia knocked on the door. Without responding to my greeting, she walked in, enveloped me in a tight hug, and then quickly handed me a memory card before turning and fleeing, tears streaming down her face. Curious and moved, I took the card inside, where Wendy and I plugged it into the computer. What we saw was explosive. A recording of Sophia confronting Tracy about her lies to both herself and Children's Services. It captured Tracy's desperate attempt to justify her actions before Sophia finally cut ties with her former friend for good. Our initial excitement was tempered when we realized that, despite the recording's illegal nature, its value was limited. We considered sending it anonymously to our new media contacts, but decided against it to avoid causing trouble for Sophia. Our resolve to fight dirty had its boundaries. The following day, Reginald Pike, LLB, showed up unannounced, flanked by no journalists. He attempted to serve us both with lawsuits. In the end, one of us managed to film the encounter, but it was clear that we were being sued for an enormous sum, despite our financial situation. The whole affair felt like a pointless exercise, and after the commotion, we returned to our routine. Our vigil was indeed a lonely one. The store was nearly empty that day, likely due to competitors capitalizing on Mr. Smith's misfortune by aggressively advertising their own similar products. The market seemed to be in a feeding frenzy. Throughout the day, we kept busy filming ourselves and capturing footage of every delivery truck that arrived. We focused on the logos of the delivery companies, hoping to persuade them to sever ties with Mr. Smith. At 2 p.m., two visibly anxious employees emerged from the store. They shared that they had been warned at a staff meeting about potential job losses, which was disheartening. Wendy conducted an interview with me, encouraging other reputable companies to consider hiring these affected workers. We added that footage to our collection. By 3:30 p.m., the state news vans reappeared, and 3 more attorneys in suits, this time without ties, arrived. They introduced themselves on camera and expressed their sympathy for our plight. Moved by our story and the apparent injustice, they offered to provide us with pro bono legal services for our divorce proceedings. After the cameras were off, their chief, Brian Coulson, revealed that he was a former partner of Pike and Suden. He had been wronged by them, and his own experience had driven him to offer us his help. There's no fury like a scorned lawyer. We invited Brian Coulson and his colleagues to join Wendy in her office for coffee at the cafe across the street. They were still there when my workday ended, and I joined them for over 15 cups of coffee. By the time we left, we had signed agreements for them to represent us in our divorces and in my fight for custody of the children. Coulson's eyes lit up when we mentioned Sophia's recording, though we declined to give him a copy. If he had been a typical lawyer, he might have reached for an atlas to point out her location on a map when it came to discussing ethics. At this point, our story had become in the public interest segment at the end of the news. Brian looked particularly sharp, his open-collared shirt adding to his media presence. It felt like we had established a classic relationship, like remoras and sharks. Remoras are small fish that attach themselves to sharks, benefiting from their protection and scraps in exchange for cleaning and keeping the shark free of parasites. If Mr. Coulson wanted to see himself as the shark in this scenario, I was fine with that arrangement. The week and the first half of the next passed with only one notable development: my growing longing for my children and Wendy. Meanwhile, Coulson ensured that our request for an interim order to recover half of our liquid assets received ample media coverage. We filed for an order to vacate the premises and demand my children for visitation. Our newfound celebrity status garnered substantial media attention, which was beneficial. Australians have always been known for supporting the underdog, and the state news reporters seemed to take a liking to Wendy, which certainly worked in our favor. Perhaps it was the high-profile nature of the case that expedited our hearing, which was scheduled for the following Monday. I was set to present my case first, with Wendy slated to follow right after. During the latter part of the week, I began to appreciate Mr. Coulson's willingness to fight dirty, which was something I admired about him. We decided not to visit the store on Thursday, but when we learned that customers were beginning to return, we resumed our vigil on Friday. I'm glad we did. At 9 a.m. that Friday, Mr. Smith himself drove into the parking lot, accompanied by the highway patrol, their lights flashing. Perhaps the flashy custom plates and the visible patrol car were not the best idea. It took the officers about 6 minutes, but they eventually found a violation. I waved cheerfully as they left the parking lot after issuing the citation. Wendy filmed the scene, capturing the moment Mr. Smith entered his business through the front door. We wanted to document that any interaction initiated was our initiative, and that he had, in fact, violated our restraining order. An hour later, Wendy noticed two more suited gentlemen arriving in a car and getting out in the parking lot. A local bank's logo caught my eye as two men headed towards the store. Wendy approached them, noting with a smile, "It's the 24th today, isn't it? Guess who had to pay off a loan yesterday?" I could only grin in response. We went to bed early that night, celebrating modestly with the vacation pay that had just been transferred to a new bank account. To mark the occasion, we decided to go to the movies instead of our usual evening in front of the TV. That weekend, I struggled with sleep, anxiously awaiting Monday's court hearing, which would determine the future of my family. Unexpected visitors on Saturday, though, provided a welcome distraction. An old friend of Wendy's had seen a commercial and reached out, and late in the afternoon, Tracy, along with her parents and sister, arrived. I stopped by the store for an impromptu barbecue. Wendy, naturally the gracious hostess, entertained everyone while I was away. As I reflected on the motives of our guests, I suspected that, now fully aware of the situation, Tracy's parents had come to realize that justice was on my side. They likely wanted to ensure continued access to their grandchildren. The gathering was pleasant, and everyone seemed to enjoy themselves. At one point, Beth managed to pull me aside. "How's your back, Dave?" she asked. "Fine, Beth," I replied. "No sharp pains when the metaphorical knife stabs into your back?" she pressed. I shook my head, noting her concern. "What's going on with Tracy?" "Your sister's not happy," Beth said. "You're not playing by her rules. You should be begging and pleading by now. Your little protest outside the store threw them off balance. Saying they're a little disgruntled is like saying the Pope is a little Catholic. Tracy is... Of course, she blames it all on you, pretending as if she's the innocent one while butter won't melt in her mouth. Mom and Dad don't even talk to her, and Sophia was the first of her friends to jump ship. According to my dear sister, she and her lover are so afraid of public backlash that they won't even go out to restaurants. Even at the country club, people are talking about it. Keep it up, brother. You're winning, dear. How sad. Never mind, how are the kids?" "Not bad, Dave," Beth replied. "They're a little sad and confused, as you'd expect. I visit every couple of days and play with them. Here, I've got some pictures." She pulled out her camera and I flipped through them. Tears welled up in my eyes. Only one photo showed Maddie smiling, and it was a forced smile. I thanked Beth profusely for all her support, and we rejoined the other guests. As we left the room, Beth pretended to drop a bunch of keys on the floor with exaggerated clumsiness. "Oh, dear. I think I dropped the keys to the Mercedes, your wife's car keys, and the spare key to the house," she said with a grin. We both laughed and went back to the mundane routine. Sunday morning, just as I woke up, I heard a shout from across the hallway. "Hey, Sloppy, it's your turn to make breakfast." I wrapped a white towel around my waist, hung a tea towel on my arm like a servant, and headed out to the kitchen. By 10 a.m. on the third Monday of my vacation, Wendy escorted me to the family court hearing. It was then that I finally got a good look at Mike. I recognized him immediately when Wendy pointed him out. I hissed and tensed as he walked in. In his 50s, he was overweight and balding, a far cry from the trim figure he must have had when he seduced Tracy 15 years ago. Although not experts in family law, Slugged and Pike had sent an assistant along with him. He was an old friend of Mr. Coulson, but that didn't prevent him from working hard for his client. Coulson started by presenting our side of the financial issues, and the opposition countered with their own arguments. Their strategy was to argue that Tracy needed our assets to support her children. After Coulson introduced my motion for joint custody, he tried to request an order for the children to be interviewed by Children's Services staff to express their views. However, the opposition managed to block this attempt through legal maneuvering. Her boyfriend then conferred with Tracy, who had been casting daggers in my direction all morning, and asked for a brief recess. After a whispered conversation with Coulson, Mr. Coulson approached me. Your dear wife wants you to know that if you don't back down, she will go public with all her accusations of abuse against you and the children. She's willing to forfeit all claims to the house and money if you give up the children." I glanced at Tracy, who was smiling smugly, then looked at Wendy, seeking strength. Wendy had been shifting between smiles and frowns all morning, depending on the mood of the proceedings. "Winning or losing," Coulson continued, "you know what you need to give me." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small tape recorder, handing it to him. Sophia had given me permission to use it as a last resort. Coulson turned back to his opponent, and I watched the villain's face fall as he reviewed a few edited excerpts. Their voices were raised enough for me to catch some of the words, "unacceptable," and "to hell with the media," among them. After a few minutes, Coulson's opponent left the room. 10 minutes later, he returned and sat down next to Tracy without saying a word. The judge was called back in, and the antagonist transformed into the good guy. "Your Honor," he said, "on behalf of my firm, I must inform you that due to new evidence, we can no longer represent the defendant in this case." Tracy looked stunned and confused as the judge confirmed the attorney's recusal. We all watched him pack up and leave. I leaned over to Coulson, who whispered in my ear, "Rumor has it that Slugged and Pike have lost a lot of business over this case. A few more clients are threatening to leave. I guess our little recording scared them off." Coulson continued, "Don't worry. The judge will understand what today's performance was all about. He's playing golf with my boss later." Before I could ask what that meant, the judge made it clear. He adjourned the case, giving Tracy 2 weeks to find another representative. He stated that he did not want to make a ruling until he had more clarity on the situation. Until the custody issues were resolved, which of course had not yet been settled, the judge was unwilling to lift the restraining order due to unresolved abuse allegations. This meant an additional 2 weeks of separation from my children. The judge also adjourned Wendy's case. Outside the courthouse, no reporters were visible. They were busy chasing a more sensational story about lawyers dropping their client. That night, Slugged and Pike issued a statement that included terms like conscience and good judgment, which only fueled further speculation. Any sense of victory I might have felt was overshadowed by how much I missed my children. The mounting tension was also beginning to take its toll on Wendy, who was starting to feel guilty about living off my resources. I reassured her, expressing that I couldn't have made it this far without her emotional support. Sitting outside the store for another 2 weeks felt unbearable, and getting media attention was increasingly difficult. I was already dreading the possibility of having to resort to extreme measures just to get noticed. I decided to skip Tuesday's protest and simply monitor customer traffic from a distance. Just after lunch, my phone rang with an invitation from a mysterious individual named Henry, who wanted to meet at a coffee shop across town. I asked Wendy to keep watch from afar with a camera to ensure everything stayed on track. Nothing untoward happened during my meeting with Henry, or if it did, no evidence was revealed. Henry turned out to be the assistant manager from the store, and his covert approach was meant to keep rumors at bay. He urged me to resume my vigil outside the store, revealing that the bank was pressuring Mr. Smith to sell the store quickly and at a loss to cover the debt. The bank knew they couldn't recover the loan while Smith was in charge. Henry, along with several employees, was secretly negotiating with the bank to buy back the store's stock. Wendy and I were heartened by this news and resumed our posts with renewed energy. Later in the week, our lawyers provided more good news. Wendy handed them a batch of documents related to an agreement made during the transfer of inheritance. This agreement involved investing in a business that was supposed to pay monthly dividends. The reinvested amount had grown into a substantial sum. Saturday, a day off from our store vigil, saw the beginning of the store's closing process, partly to avoid paying overtime. We invited Beth, her parents, and a new old friend over for a barbecue. Beth briefly updated us on the latest at the Smith mansion, noting that things were not going well. She mentioned that Tracy's paranoia had led her to suspect Beth of being a double agent, resulting in a strained relationship and fewer visits over the past week. As we were finishing our meal, the doorbell rang. I answered to find Tracy standing there. "Aren't you supposed to be here?" I asked, puzzled. "Apparently if I come to you, it'll be okay," she replied. I invited her inside. She hesitated upon seeing her parents and Wendy, who shot her a disdainful look before retreating upstairs. I assumed Beth was hiding somewhere, as the looks her mother and father cast at Tracy were anything but friendly. Tracy was growing increasingly uncomfortable and called me into the kitchen. "Dave, for old time's sake, could you back off a bit?" she asked. "Why, dear? Didn't the trade work out as you hoped?" I inquired. "You know it didn't," she admitted. "I thought that by taking all the money and the house, you'd be forced to let Mick adopt the kids. Then, once I'm married again, we could prove to him that you're no longer capable of having his child and take him for all he's worth." Tracy stared at the table for a long moment before continuing. "I was planning to come back to you after I had his money. Honestly, Dave, I thought I could enjoy being a rich man's wife in the meantime. But you've ruined it. His business is failing, and we can't even go out in public. After the smear campaign you started, the last time we went to a restaurant, an old lady spat on me. And don't even get me started on the police. I've been stopped 3 times this week. I'm just 3 points away from losing my license." Her eyes welled up with tears. "Can't you back off and let me live my dream?" "Honey, I thought you were a student of history," I replied. "You know what Churchill and Roosevelt said. Those who do not learn from the mistakes of history are doomed to repeat them. I see your surprise attack on our family as comparable to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the British colonies in Asia on December 7, 1941. Because of the nature of that attack, Churchill and Roosevelt had no choice but to demand the complete surrender of the attackers. If you had asked for a divorce politely before your betrayal, we could have split things up amicably, and you could have moved on. Instead, you chose the Pearl Harbor approach, and now I will accept nothing short of total surrender." I watched as the realization dawned on her that her grand plan had overlooked some crucial details. Her face hardened, clearly recognizing that her emotional appeal wasn't going to get her anywhere. "Mike wants to have a serious discussion tonight. Can you come over?" Tracy asked. "Yeah, and I just fell off the turnip truck," I replied. "Show up at your place and risk being arrested for violating a restraining order? No thanks." "Well, we could meet here," she suggested. "Why not?" I shot back. "Because if Michael Smith comes within 100 yards of me, I'm going to rip his head off and spit down his neck." Tracy looked taken aback. She'd never seen this side of me before. "What did he do to you?" "Let me count the ways," I said. "He entertained my wife, incited her to blow through all my money, and stole my children. What's not to like?" Tracy stared at the table, clearly unsettled. The idea of negotiating for my children rather than leaving it to the whims of the court system prompted my next suggestion. "How about Skype?" "Yeah, that might work. What time?" she asked. "Hold on, I need to coordinate with my partner." "Partner?" Tracy echoed, puzzled. "Wendy," I clarified. "We make all our decisions together." "That old," Tracy started. "Who are you calling old? Have you seen who you've been sleeping with lately? How old is she anyway?" "I don't care," Tracy retorted. "She's been a good friend when I needed it, so who cares?" I went upstairs to discuss it with Wendy, who was all for it. After all, what did we have to lose? Back downstairs, I arranged the Skype call with Tracy for 9 p.m. She left, casting an angry look at her parents and a final glance around the house. I swear I saw tears in her eyes. The party wrapped up around 8:30. I set up my laptop on 2 chairs at the sides of the table. But Wendy decided she would sit off camera. She said if she didn't bat her eyes at Michael Smith for the rest of her life, she would be just fine. At exactly 9 p.m., I logged into Skype. The screen showed Michael Smith and Tracy sitting side by side, clearly poised for a confrontation. Wendy had showered and was now in her robe, sitting by the entrance to the kitchen. There were no pleasantries. The tension was palpable as both parties clearly vied for dominance. It became evident that Michael Smith was more dominant in this exchange. His initial move suggested he believed he still had leverage. "Let's get down to business," Smith began. "Let me make one thing clear from the start," I said firmly. Smith's eyes widened in surprise, and he glanced at Tracy with a mixture of frustration and concern. He realized he had lost his initial advantage. "Okay, David," Smith said, his tone attempting to regain composure. "Where's my ex-wife?" I responded, "Please be polite. She's listening, but she prefers not to engage directly. If you can't manage that, we'll end this call right now." My firm stance had shifted the balance slightly in my favor. I heard Wendy chuckle softly at my choice of words. Tracy shot me a disapproving look, clearly irritated. "All right, David," Smith continued. "Here's my offer. If you agree to stop your protests outside the store and perhaps hold a press conference to declare it was all a misunderstanding, I'll sign over the house and return half the money. I'll also agree to let you see the kids every other weekend." "Is that all you're offering?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "And what about Wendy?" Smith's dismissive tone shifted to one of mock sincerity. "Wendy? Why should I care about her? At this point, she's just a side note. I'm willing to give her 10% of the profits once the business is back on its feet." I glanced at Wendy, who responded with a look that spoke volumes. In her gaze, the middle finger was unmistakably prominent. I smiled and repeated her gesture towards the camera. "As for your offer of visitation," I said firmly, "I've decided that neither of you will see my children, so you can shove your offer where the sun doesn't shine." Smith tried to remain composed, though his frustration was evident. "Be reasonable, Mr. Brown. Once I have a child of my own, I won't care about yours, and you can have them all to yourself." I observed Tracy's reaction closely. Her frown was less about anger at losing her children, and more about irritation at having her plans exposed. "So you want me to leave my children in the care of someone who treats them like bargaining chips? You have 12 days and 2 weeks to make your choice. Use Vaseline if you need to." Both Smith and Tracy spoke in unison, but their combined voices did little to sway me. Tracy had clearly lost this round. "Come on, Dave," Tracy said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Are you still upset that I left you for a better man?" At that moment, Smith rose from his chair and stood behind Tracy, draping an arm around her. It was a calculated move, clearly intended to be recorded and used against us, with a mixture of disdain and amusement as the scene unfolded. Hoping to provoke a strong reaction for court purposes, Tracy and Smith put on a dramatic show, but I remained completely unmoved by their performance. My indifference, however, was tested when I felt a soft, warm arm slip around my shoulders from behind, and something gentle pressed against my neck. "Be a gentleman and don't look back for a minute," came the whispered command. It was Wendy. She turned my head and kissed me softly on the lips. We lingered for a few moments before breaking the kiss and turning our attention back to the screen. Tracy's expression had soured dramatically. The contrast between her self-image and the reality on the screen was jarring, shattering any illusions she might have had. Her face twisted in anger as she ordered, "Get your hands off my husband." I leaned in close to Wendy and whispered, savoring the warmth of her neck. "Nice tactic," I said. Wendy whispered back, "I expected him to pull something like that, but not her. Remember, don't look back." The warm feeling from Wendy's touch faded as I kept my promise and didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The little selfie in the top corner of the screen showed me everything I needed to see. Despite my efforts to be a gentleman, I was still human. The mumbling voices from the other end were lost on me as I remained lost in my thoughts. The doorbell rang, snapping me out of my reverie. While Wendy finished dressing, I went outside to answer it. To my immense joy, it was my kids. As soon as I opened the door, they enveloped me in their tiny, eager arms, mumbling excitedly. James snuggled against my chest, while MD clung to my leg. Fighting back tears of happiness, I savored the moment. Wendy soon joined us with the camera, and I asked her to keep our internet friends entertained for a bit. I then took the kids to a quiet spot where they eventually calmed down. One by one, they shared their stories. They had sore feet from sneaking out of the mansion and walking through the night. Aunt Beth had helped James with some comfort along the way, and they were glad to be reunited with me. He recorded his mom on camera, telling them to eat your own damn breakfast, while the kids, visibly shaking from hunger and exhaustion, clung to me. I quickly brought them glasses of milk and instructed them to sip slowly. I assured them that Wendy, a kind woman, would come soon to look after them. Back in the kitchen, I signaled for Wendy to come in and asked her to keep an eye on the kids. Taking a deep breath, I sat down in front of my laptop. Tracy, noticing something on my face, fell silent, but eventually couldn't hold back any longer. "I just wrote him," Tracy said. "Where are the kids?" I demanded. "Upstairs in bed," she replied. "No, they're not," I countered. "They just walked through the dark to get here. They told me they didn't eat properly." Tracy, recovering first from the barrage of accusations, responded with a defensive edge. "We'll come and get them soon." No, you won't, I snapped. The day I leave them alone with you is the day I'll see Satan ice skating to work. If I see you anywhere near here, I'll take whatever measures necessary to keep you from seeing them. Tracy's face showed a mix of surprise and triumph as she realized she had struck a nerve. The connection went dead soon after, and I confirmed that the conversation was recorded on my end. I then went to check on the kids. Maddie was happily sitting on Wendy's lap, chatting about her favorite topic, horses. James was next to her, gazing intently at her face. I took out the remaining pizza and asked them to eat slowly. Knowing what was coming next, I took the camera from James and transferred the footage to my laptop. I created a folder and placed the camera files, Sophia's voice recording, and the Skype session file into it. I then fast-forwarded through the Skype recording to the relevant parts. I wanted to make a note of the time and took a picture of Maddie's bruised wrists, adding it to the folder. It was another half hour before the doorbell rang. I used the time to comfort the kids with hugs until they were calm and called Beth to come over. Wendy was reading a story to the children when two female childcare workers knocked on the door around 10:30 p.m. I invited them in and offered them drinks, but they were defensive and hostile. They insisted they were there to return the children to their mother. "I'm afraid that's unacceptable to me," I said firmly. Despite their attempts to argue, I seated them, showed them the bruises on Maddie's wrists, and had her explain how she got them. I also had James describe his experience of hunger and showed them a video of Tracy yelling at the kids. Additionally, I played a clip of Tracy saying, "Once I have a baby of my own, I won't care about yours, and you can take them back." "So you're really going to send them back to that?" I asked, "after they were allowed to wander around here in the dark?" The workers looked visibly uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have to enforce the current order," one of them said. "You've been accused of abuse, and if we leave them here and something happens, we could be in serious trouble." "We have superiors to answer to," one of the childcare workers said, their tone defensive. I kept my voice steady and low as I replied, "I assure you, if you place them back in an environment where you already have evidence of abuse, not just claims, and they get hurt again, I'll be the one held accountable." "Are you threatening us, sir?" one of them asked, alarmed. "No," I said calmly. "I'm just giving you a sense of what the situation will be like before the older of the two might decide to call the police." I then proposed an alternative. "My wife's sister is on her way over. If everyone agrees, I would be happy to hand the children over to her as a neutral party, provided that neither of you takes them from her." The elder worker stepped aside to presumably consult with Tracy. When she returned, she confirmed that the arrangement had been accepted. It seemed Tracy and her allies were content with this resolution, likely seeing it as a way to catch me in a compromising situation on film. I said a heartfelt goodbye to my children, promising to do everything in my power for them. They both were fond of Aunt Beth, so they accepted the change fairly easily. Wendy said nothing as I took a moment to collect myself. The next day, Wendy offered to help Beth get the kids ready for school. I agreed, and for the remainder of the week, she took on the task. I dropped the kids off at Beth's house and headed to work, as there was no point in prolonging the vigil. Henry confirmed by phone that the business was operating at a loss, but his plans to rectify the situation were progressing. The following Monday, we faced the same judge again. Tracy and I had reached agreements on all matters except for custody, so everyone was focused and prepared. Wendy went first, discussing her financial concerns, including the unpaid dividends. Mr. Smith, clearly caught off guard by this revelation, looked visibly distressed. The opposing interests were represented by an out-of-town firm, which, judging by their performance, seemed to be struggling. The judge decided he would not rule on the specific amounts until forensic accountants assessed the value of the unpaid dividends. However, he indicated that after Wendy's dividends were settled, her total share would amount to $6,535. He admitted that he had been stern with Mr. Smith due to his unpleasant demeanor. Wendy expressed her willingness for Mr. Smith to keep the house as a status symbol, understanding its significance to him, but she made it clear she had no intention of living there herself. In my case, the opposing lawyers attempted to introduce an illegal Skype recording of a conversation as evidence. We agreed to its admission, much to their confusion. They played only the segment where I made threatening remarks, combined with Tracy's accusations of abuse, in an effort to portray me as the villain. I maintained my composure throughout, enduring the ordeal. Before the trial, Beth and Sophia were brought in, and their testimonies highlighted that I was a far superior father compared to Tracy as a mother. Beth's statements were so compelling that they significantly impacted the judge's perception. I asked her to confirm that she was Tracy's sister, not mine. Tracy, stunned by the betrayal, fled the courtroom, not returning for either session. When it was my turn, Mr. Coulson guided me through recounting the initial ambush, the children walking to my residence in the dark. He highlighted the hunger strike and noted that their mother and foster father were unaware of the situation. Coulson presented the children's testimony, gathered by Child Services, on these and other matters. The opposition played the Skype recording, but struggled to object when we introduced additional footage, particularly Tracy's reaction to her partner's indifference towards my children. Coulson sought to admit the footage recorded by James. The opposition tried to block it by citing rules of evidence, but the judge intervened, stating, "Gentlemen, this is not a criminal trial. Different rules apply here. My duty is to do what's best for the children involved, and I take that responsibility seriously. Mr. Coulson, you may present the videotape." As the footage played, I saw Tracy's reaction to a 10-minute tape, where she confessed to Sophia that she had lied to Child Services about my alleged abuse. The courtroom was silent, the shock palpable, and their reaction was one of collective gasps as Tracy's falsehoods were exposed. On the tape, the kids heard Tracy claim that it was entirely Michael Smith's idea. The judge watched silently for the last 4 minutes, her head buried in her hands. Michael Smith's displeasure was evident, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication as I saw him squirm. When the opposition attorney was asked to explain their recusal, he stood there, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to provide a coherent answer. The judge then addressed me directly, stating he had one question. "Mr. Brown, could you please clarify the threat you made to Mrs. Brown and Mr. Smith? I've also heard claims of threatening behavior towards child support workers." I was prepared for this line of questioning. I had anticipated an emotional argument and had my responses well researched and ready. I stood and met the judge's gaze firmly. "Yes, Your Honor, I can clarify. You've heard the same evidence I have that my children were taken due to neglect and abuse. I've always viewed it not just as my responsibility, but as my privilege to protect my children from harm. I am willing to risk everything, even my freedom, to defend them. If that means threatening those who've harmed them, I stand by those actions. I would do it again in a heartbeat." For a moment, I thought the judge might be embarrassed by my bold stance, but instead I saw admiration in his eyes. He nodded and retreated to deliberate. Less than an hour later, the judge returned with his decision. I was granted full custody of the children, with Tracy's access subject to my discretion. I overheard Coulson murmuring his approval. The judge's decision was unprecedented. He ruled that all legal costs would not be reimbursed by utility funds. I was granted the house and 65% of the liquid assets. He admitted that his stern stance against Tracy was due to her underhanded tactics during the initial proceedings. You could almost see the smoke rising from the journalists' pencils as they scrambled to cover the verdict. Outside the courthouse, a few reporters approached me, but I was so elated that I barely remember what I said. Wendy took the kids home, and I went to collect all their belongings from the mansion. During that time, Tracy and Michael were arguing loudly. Back at home, I cherished every moment with my children, though they surprisingly preferred Wendy's bedtime stories to mine. They claimed she was better at it, which, after reading their books 1,000 times, I took as a fair assessment. The next night, Wendy and I hosted a party to celebrate, with Mr. Coulson and his staff as the guests of honor. There were a couple of journalists at the event, and Mr. Coulson took the opportunity to discuss his pro bono work. The entire Tracy family attended, along with many of our mutual friends and some of Wendy's new acquaintances. Even my supervisor showed up, making some snide remarks about having a star employee in his field. I proposed a toast to Beth, officially honoring her as the favorite aunt. As the evening wore on and the party dwindled to a family gathering, I sat at the table with Beth and her mother. John was asleep on one of the couches, and Wendy was reading a story to the children. My mother-in-law asked a question that had been on my mind all day. "Dave, how often do you plan to let Tracy visit the kids?" I paused, considering her question. I don't know, Mom. I suppose it depends on what Tracy wants. If she wants to see them, I won't stand in her way. After all, children benefit from the presence of a caring adult in their lives. My ex-mother-in-law leaned back and shook her head. Dave, for someone so brilliant, you can be remarkably obtuse. Your children are here with a woman they clearly love and who adores them, and yet you're still uncertain? I turned quickly, almost knocking over a chair. Wendy looked up and saw 3 people staring at her, one of whom appeared incredulous. She blushed deeply as she realized what was happening. I moved gently towards the couch, aware that my next words wouldn't win any awards but were heartfelt. The mother of these children seems to have stepped away from her role. Would you be interested in taking on that position? As if by magic, Wendy rose from the couch and melted into my arms. We shared a long, deep kiss while the kids snuggled up to us, creating a cozy, perfect moment. After putting the children to bed, we said goodbye to our guests. I carried Wendy into our bedroom, and as we stood on the threshold, she asked, "Have you formally asked me to marry you yet?" "Yes, I thought I did," I replied, a bit flustered. "Did I not?" "Not formally, I suppose," Wendy said with a smile. "Well, I'm certainly not cut out for being a foreman or an engineer. Maybe once we have more money, I could go back to school." "That sounds fantastic to me," I said, relieved. "And who isn't up to what Grandma expects?" In the weeks that followed, Tracy never contacted me about visiting the children, nor did they ask about her. Wendy was too busy, and the bank facilitated the sale of the store to a group of managers and employees. Henry, a local celebrity, asked me to unveil a large management sign to attract media attention. By the end of the first week, the store was back in operation, and my bank account began to recover, matching Wendy's balance as agreed. Tracy simply took the cash, while her ex walked away with the mansion and enough capital to start over. Tracy and Michael remained together, according to family rumors. Perhaps they might have stayed that way if I hadn't crossed paths with Mr. Smith. One day, he made a sarcastic comment that wiped the smile off my face as his appeal began. Apparently, his legal team felt some evidence should have been excluded. I asked Mr. Coulson to monitor the court registry for me. He discovered that everything was on hold while the couple was on a month-long cruise in the West Indies. Coincidentally, Mr. Smith received a fax while they were docked. Tracy, who had been released from a C-section and hysterectomy 9 years prior, was given basic care instructions. How did I know the ship was docked in a country where hitting women is strongly condemned? As an honest person, I never inquired about how all those homeless individuals ended up in the mansion, causing so much damage that it became uninhabitable. After all, if I find evidence of a crime, it's my civic duty to report it. Who knew that insurance companies refused to cover damages when customers left their homes unattended for a month? Where did I put the keys Beth gave me? Was that the burned-out Mercedes I saw on the side of the highway yesterday? At the end of my first year at university, I offered to work part-time until graduation to help care for our baby. Wendy, however, expressed concern about how long she could tolerate being married to someone without qualifications. Thank you for taking the time to hear today's story. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have a tale to share about your own or someone else's circumstances, don't hesitate to contact me. Take care.